The biometric ping should not have existed at all. An archivist second-class Serel Cadron stared at her console for a full minute before she trusted herself to believe it. The archive wing where Serel worked occupied the lowest, oldest level of the Concordance complex. A long, quiet gallery of humming data columns and soft amber lighting that most of the Concord's younger staff considered a dull and unglamorous posting, the kind of work assigned to people who preferred certainty to ambition. Serel had chosen it deliberately. Among her people, the Overai, whose natural lifespan stretched across centuries, and whose culture prized the slow accumulation of understanding over any single dramatic act, archival work was not considered dull at all, but a kind of quiet devotion, a way of honoring the long, patient shape of history rather than merely passing through it. She had spent 11 years in that gallery already, cataloging trade disputes and border resurveys and the thousand small bureaucratic footnotes that, taken together, formed the true texture of galactic governance, and she had never once expected any of it to matter beyond the narrow satisfaction of a well-organized record. The Concordance Chamber's seating registry was the oldest continuously maintained record in the entire assembly, older than the current governing charter, older than 3 of the 5 founding species still counted among the living stars. It logged every delegate who had ever sat in every seat since the chamber's construction, a passive courtesy system meant to note attendance for the historical archive and nothing more. Serel had pulled the registry only because her supervisor wanted a routine centennial audit finished before the anniversary session, the kind of dull, procedural task junior archivists were handed precisely because nobody expected it to reveal anything at all. And yet there it was, glowing on her display in the pale green of an active biometric signature. Seat 7, designation Earth, status occupied. That can't be right, she murmured, and ran the query a second time, then a third, each attempt returning the same impossible result. Seat 7, the seat that had stood empty in the physical chamber for 911 years, ever since the event every schoolchild in the Concord learned about before they learned to read, the cradle collapse, the silence that fell over humanity's homeworld after its founding species turned inward, sealed its borders, and within 2 generations, simply stopped answering any signal sent its way. That seat had registered an occupant, however briefly. During 11 separate sessions over the past 9 centuries, the most recent only 4 years ago. Serel sat back in her chair, the pale bioluminescent patterns along her forearms flickering with the particular agitation that, among her people, the Overai, passed for something between excitement and dread. The Overai lived long lives and valued patience over urgency in almost everything, but even the eldest archivists she had studied under had never mentioned an anomaly like this. Either the registry was malfunctioning in a way nobody had noticed for 9 centuries, which seemed vanishingly unlikely given how many independent systems cross-checked it, or someone, or something, had been quietly occupying humanity's abandoned seat in the heart of galactic government for the better part of a millennium, without a single soul in the wider Concord ever noticing. The Concordance Chamber itself, several levels above the quiet archive gallery where Serel spent her days, was widely considered one of the great architectural achievements of the founding era. A vast, circular hall built from stone and alloy contributed by all 5 founding species, each material chosen to represent something of its origin world's particular relationship to permanence. Seat 7 sat at the northern curve of the great table, a plain, unadorned chair carved from a pale, silver-veined wood that Concord records described only as native to Earth, its surface worn smooth in places by centuries of ceremonial dusting, rather than any actual use, kept in careful, respectful condition by groundskeeping staff who had never expected, in any of their working lifetimes, that it would need to look presentable for an actual occupant again. Serel had walked past that empty chair 100 times over the years, on the rare occasions her duties took her up into the chamber proper, and had always felt, without quite examining the feeling closely. A faint, unplaceable melancholy radiating from it. The particular sadness of a seat kept ready for a guest everyone privately believed would never return. She should have flagged it and moved on to the next line item, the way any properly disciplined junior archivist would have done. Instead, she pulled every session log associated with those 11 anomalous readings, cross-referenced them against the Concord's own historical rec. Ored and found something that made the bioluminescent patterns along her arms flare bright enough to catch the attention of the archivist working the console beside her. Every single one of those 11 sessions corresponded to a vote, a decision, or a crisis that historians across the galaxy still cited as a turning point. The Threndel Plague containment, 3 centuries earlier, had been, by every contemporary account, a matter of hours rather than days. A pathogen with an incubation period short enough that the quarantine vote, delayed by procedural argument for nearly 2 full sessions, would almost certainly have come too late to prevent it spreading past its original outbreak zone, had the final vote not passed, unexpectedly, and by a margin historians had never fully explained. In the closing minutes of the second session, the Second Karsu War, a full century before that, had ended not through military victory, but through a treaty neither side had been willing to propose until, according to surviving diplomatic correspondence, an anonymous compromise document appeared in the negotiating record overnight, phrased with a precision and even-handedness that both delegations later credited, somewhat sheepishly, with saving them from a war neither could actually have won. And the Velen Prime terraforming failure, only 40 years past, had been halted less than 6 hours before the array's containment field would have failed catastrophically. An emergency shutdown vote that passed, according to the session record, after a single unattributed technical brief was quietly submitted to the council floor, correctly identifying a fault in the array's core structure that Concord engineers had spent weeks failing to locate on their own. 11 moments, scattered across 900 years, when the Concord had stood at the edge of catastrophe and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, stepped back from it. And in every single one of those 11 sessions, for a window of time ranging from 6 minutes to just under 2 hours, Earth's abandoned seat had shown someone sitting in it. Serel did not sleep that night. She spent it instead reading everything the Concord's central archive held on the Cradle Collapse, a body of history so thoroughly documented and so rarely questioned that she had genuinely never considered, until now, how strange its central premise actually was. Somewhere near the middle of that long, sleepless night, she found herself calling her elder sibling Tessic, an artisan glassworker 3 systems away who had never shown the faintest interest in Concord politics or ancient history, mostly, Serel suspected, because Tessic found the slow, patient accumulation of institutional record-keeping considerably less interesting than the slow, patient accumulation of light through hand-shaped glass. She had not meant to say anything about the discovery at all, only to hear a familiar voice at an hour when her own thoughts felt too large for the quiet gallery around her. But Tessic, perceptive in the particular way only a sibling who has known you since infancy can be, asked what was wrong within the first few words of greeting. "I found something today that isn't supposed to exist," Serel admitted finally, and found, once she had said it aloud to someone outside the careful, procedural language of an official report, that the strangeness of it settled differently in her chest, less like a professional anomaly, and more like a genuine, personal unsettling of everything she had assumed to be true about the shape of galactic history. A seat that's been empty for 900 years might not actually be empty. "I don't know what to do with that." "You keep looking," Tessic said simply, in the unhurried tone that had always made her easier to talk to than anyone else in Serel's long life. "That's what you've always done, since you were small enough that I had to carry you between the reading stacks because your legs weren't long enough yet. You find a strange shape in the record, and you keep looking until it makes sense, even when everyone around you has decided it's easier not to look at all. I don't know what you found, but I know you well enough to know you're not going to be able to leave it alone, so you may as well stop pretending otherwise and just follow it properly." It was a small conversation, unremarkable by any measure that would ever appear in an official record, and yet Serel returned to her console afterward with a steadiness she had not expected to find, carrying her siblings' unhurried confidence with her into the months of investigation that followed, long after the conversation itself had faded into the ordinary background of memory. Humanity, the record explained, had been among the 5 founding species of the Concord, admitted with unusual speed given the relative youth of their civilization at the time, largely on the strength of a diplomatic delegation that early Concord official S had described in surviving correspondence as disarmingly direct, occasionally reckless, and remarkably good at finding compromises nobody else in the room had thought to propose. For nearly 2 centuries, Earth's seat had been an active and, by most historical accounts, disproportionately influential voice in Concord governance, especially on matters of crisis response and containment protocol, areas where humanity's delegates seemed to possess an instinct for worst-case planning that other species found faintly unsettling, if useful. Then, according to the official record, humanity discovered something during a routine deep space survey mission that its government declined, entirely and without explanation, to share with the rest of the Concord. Diplomatic pressure escalated over several years into formal sanctions, then into a full trade quarantine when Earth's government refused, repeatedly and with increasing hostility, to disclose the nature of the discovery. Communication grew sparse, then sporadic, then stopped entirely. A relief and inquiry mission sent to the solar system 11 years after the last transmission found Earth's orbital stations dark and abandoned, its surface communications array destroyed, and no response of any kind from the planet below. The Concord, after extensive debate, classified the species as extinct or, at best, catastrophically regressed beyond any hope of recontact, closed the file, and over the following decades quietly restructured its governance to function without a species that could no longer participate in it. Buried deeper in the archive, in a transcript record that Serel suspected almost no one had actually read in several centuries, she found a fragment of the final formal session humanity's delegation had attended before the silence began, preserved word for word by the chamber's recording systems. The lead human delegate of the era, a woman the record identified only as Ambassador Reyes, had addressed the council in terms that read, even across 9 centuries and through the flattening distance of a transcript, as strikingly direct. "You are asking me to explain a fear I cannot yet fully explain to my own government," the transcript recorded her saying, "and I understand exactly how that sounds. I am asking you, in return, to trust that a species young enough in this Concord to still be finding its footing might, occasionally, be right about a danger before it has the standing to prove it. I do not know yet whether silence or disclosure is the more dangerous choice. I only know that I would rather carry the weight of that uncertainty myself than hand it to a council not yet prepared to act on it without panic. I hope, one day, we will have the chance to explain ourselves properly. I am not confident that day will come as soon as any of us would like." Serel read the passage 3 times, feeling something she could not entirely name settle into her chest, a mixture of recognition and grief for a woman who had, by the historical record's own account, never gotten the chance she had hoped for. The seat remained, because tradition and no small amount of ceremonial guilt demanded it remain, a monument to a founding member lost to its own secrecy. But no one had expected, in 911 years, that anyone would ever sit in it again. By morning, Serel had made a decision that she understood, even as she made it, might end her career before it had properly begun. She requested a private audience with Chief Archivist Toman Vashi, the oldest working archivist in the Concord's employ, and not coincidentally, the one Overai elder whose judgment she trusted more than her own. Vashti listened to her report without interruption, his weathered, patient face giving away nothing, until she had finished laying out all 11 anomalous readings in careful chronological order. When she was done, he was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged him entirely, if he was already composing the gentle but firm reprimand that would end this line of inquiry before it ever reached anyone with real authority. "I am going to tell you something," he said finally, "that I have never told another archivist in 40 years of service, because I did not believe it would ever become relevant again. When I was young, barely older than you are now, I worked under an archivist named Old Ren Pell, who claimed to have seen something similar during the Threndel Plague crisis. He said the biometric registry flagged an occupant in seat 7 during the emergency session, and that when he mentioned it to his own supervisor, he was told, in the plainest possible terms, to forget he had ever seen it, that some questions are better left unasked for reasons that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with the comfort of people who have built careers on a settled version of history." "You believe someone has been suppressing this," Serel said. "I believe," Vashti said carefully, "that 9 centuries is a very long time for a coincidence to keep happening at precisely the moments the galaxy needed it most, and that whoever or whatever has been sitting in that seat has, so far, only ever shown up to help. I am an old archivist, Serel, not a politician, and I do not know what the correct response to that fact is supposed to be. But I know that burying it again, the way it was buried when Ren Pell first found it, feels like the wrong answer, whatever the right one turns out to be." "Why did no one act on what he found?" Serel asked. "If a senior archivist noticed the same anomaly generations ago, why did it simply disappear back into the archive without a single formal inquiry?" Vashti considered the question for a long moment, his ancient, patient face unreadable in the amber light of the reading room. "Because, I suspect, it is a very frightening thing to consider that the galaxy's most consequential turning points might not have been the product of our own wisdom at all, but of a quiet hand none of us ever saw reaching in to correct our mistakes before they became irreversible. It is easier, for a great many people in positions of comfortable authority, to believe that the Concord earned its own survival through its own competence. An unseen guardian complicates that story considerably, and complicated stories rarely survive contact with institutions that prefer simple ones." "Then what do we do with it?" Serel asked, "now that it's found us twice?" "We do the only thing archivists are actually good for," Vashti said, allowing himself the faintest suggestion of a smile. "We follow the record wherever it actually leads, rather than wherever it would be most convenient for it to lead. I imagine that will make us unpopular with a great many people before this is finished. I find, at my age, that I have grown rather comfortable with being unpopular in a good cause." They took the matter together to the Concord's Oversight Council 3 days later, and the reception they received there told Serel everything she needed to know about how deeply this particular truth had already been buried, and by whom. Councillor Dreeth Asim of the Karsu Compact, a broad-shouldered delegate whose species had fought 2 devastating wars in living memory, and built an entire political identity around vigilant suspicion of any unaccounted variable in Concord security, was the first to respond, and his response was not curiosity but alarm. "You are telling me," he said, his mandibles clicking in the sharp, staccato rhythm that signaled genuine agitation among his people, "that an unidentified presence has been infiltrating the most secure chamber in Concord space for 900 years, undetected by every security measure this government has ever deployed, and your recommendation is that we simply investigate at our leisure." "My recommendation," Vashti said, with the calm patience of a man who had outlived a great many counselors' careers, "is that we investigate the truth before we decide how alarmed to be about it. 9 centuries of quiet, beneficial intervention is not the profile of an infiltration, counselor. It is the profile of something else entirely, and I would rather understand what that something else is before we respond to it as a threat, and in doing so, potentially provoke the very crisis its presence has apparently spent 9 centuries preventing. The debate that followed consumed the better part of 2 full sessions, and Serel watched, with a growing unease that had nothing to do with her people's usual patience, as the council split along lines that had far more to do with old political fault lines than with the actual evidence in front of them. Some delegates, like Asim, wanted an immediate security lockdown of the chamber and a full mobilization of Concord defense assets. Others, mostly from species with longer institutional memories of humanity's original contributions to Concord governance, argued for caution, for patience, for the possibility that the galaxy might be looking at something far stranger and far more hopeful than a threat. Counselor Asim, for his part, did not relent easily, and Serel found herself, somewhat against her expectations, developing a grudging respect for the sheer consistency of his position, even as she disagreed with nearly all of it. My people have learned at considerable cost that the moment you decide a mystery is probably benevolent is the exact moment it stops being investigated properly, he said, addressing the chamber during the second session with the same clipped precision he had shown from the very first hour. I am not accusing this ghost, whatever it turns out to be, of malice. I am saying that 9 centuries of undetected access to the most secure room in conquered space should trouble every one of you regardless of how many crises it has apparently prevented, because we do not actually know whether those intervene. Tians were acts of guardianship or careful, patient positioning for some purpose we have not yet been permitted to understand. And if it is guardianship, Ilarion replied, what precisely do you imagine we accomplish by responding to 9 centuries of quiet protection with a security lockdown and a defense mobilization? If there is a species out there capable of penetrating every safeguard this Concord has ever built without once being caught, Counselor, I would gently suggest that a show of force is unlikely to be the thing that finally provokes a confrontation none of us are prepared to survive. It was a smaller, quieter voice that ultimately shifted the room, belonging to Delegate Hessa Muriel of the Threndel Compact, whose own people had been the direct beneficiaries of one of the 11 mysterious interventions, the plague containment that had, according to the Concord's own casualty projections at the time, likely saved several million lives on her homeworld. I do not care, if I am honest, what species this presence belongs to, or what its long-term intentions might eventually prove to be, she said. I care that my grandmother is alive today because someone, or something, made a choice in that chamber that our own combined governments had failed to make in time. I would like the chance to ask them why, and to say thank you properly, before this council decides that gratitude is a luxury we cannot afford to feel until every possible risk has been ruled out first. The vote to authorize a formal, discreet investigation passed by a narrow but sufficient margin, and Serel, to her own considerable surprise, found herself named lead archivist on the inquiry, largely because, as Vashi dryly pointed out to the assembled council, she was the only person in the building who had actually noticed the anomaly in the first place, and it seemed only fair that she be the one to follow it to its conclusion. The team assembled around her in the following days was small by design, kept deliberately quiet to avoid the kind of public speculation that might, in Ilarion's careful phrasing, provoke exactly the reaction we are trying to avoid before we understand what we are actually reacting to. Vashi remained as senior advisor, lending the investigation the institutional weight of his considerable reputation. A pair of technical specialists from the Concord's engineering corps handled the delicate work of reconstructing corrupted sensor data, without disturbing whatever original systems still governed the chamber's ancient architecture. And Priyat Ashkavi, assigned by Counselor Asim himself, ostensibly to keep a Karsu security perspective embedded in an inquiry his own species remained deeply uneasy about. Arrived on Serel's first working day with the brisk, faintly skeptical efficiency of a soldier who fully expected to spend a few tedious weeks confirming a sensor malfunction before returning to more conventional duties. "I want to be clear," Pryatt told her during their first proper meeting in the reading room, "that I am here to find the mundane explanation, not to indulge whatever theory currently has the Council's attention. 900 years is a very long time for a security system to develop a fault nobody noticed. It is a considerably shorter time for a hidden extra-Concord presence to go completely undetected inside the most heavily monitored room this government has ever built. I know which of those explanations I consider more likely." "Then we agree on the method, if not yet the conclusion," Serel said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she rather liked him for the bluntness of it. "Follow the record wherever it leads. I promise you, Specialist Ashkavi, I have no more interest in manufacturing a mystery than you have in confirming one. If this mystery has hooked you the way it hooked Serel staring at that impossible green light on her console, now's a good time to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment with your best theory on who, or what, has really been sitting in humanity's empty seat for 900 years. I read every guess, and this story still has plenty of turns left, so let's keep going." The investigation, in its early weeks, produced almost nothing beyond confirmation of what Serel already knew. Every security system in the concordance chamber, cross-checked and independently audited by 3 separate agencies, showed no unauthorized entry, no unaccounted energy signature, no physical evidence of any kind that anyone had actually been present in Seat 7 during those 11 sessions. And yet the biometric registry, a system so old and so deeply embedded in the chamber's original construction that no one currently employed by the Concord fully understood its underlying architecture, insisted, with quiet and unshakable consistency, that someone had. "It's as if the seat itself has been lying to us," said Pryatt Ashkavi, the young Karsu security specia. List assigned to work alongside Serel's team, a soldier by training who had clearly expected this assignment to be a formality before returning to more conventional duties, and who grew visibly more unsettled with each week that passed without a rational explanation presenting itself. "Every other system says empty. Only the registry says otherwise. Either the registry is broken in a way nobody's caught in 900 years, or something is getting past every sensor we have, and only the oldest, most primitive system in the building is honest enough to notice." It was Serel, working late into a cycle that the rest of her team had already abandoned for rest, who found the detail that changed everything. Buried in the original architectural specifications for the concordance chamber, drafted during the founding era when all 5 species had contributed design elements to the building meant to represent their shared government, she found a single clause, easy to overlook amid thousands of pages of structural and ceremonial detail, describing Seat 7's registry sensor as operating on what the specification called, without further elaboration, a resonance keyed to founding biological signature. Independent of standard Concord detection architecture, per delegation request. "Per delegation request," Serel read aloud to Vashi, later that night, in the quiet of the archive's lower reading room. "Humanity asked for their seat to have its own separate detection system, built into the founding architecture itself, something no other seat has. Why would they do that unless they already suspected, even then, that they might one day need a way back into this room that nobody else could detect or block?" Vashi turned the specification page over in his hands, studying the clause as though it might reveal something further under sufficient scrutiny. "Or," he offered, "they suspected, even at the very beginning, that they might one day need to leave in a hurry, and wanted to be certain the door back would still be theirs alone to open, regardless of whatever happened to the rest of their standing in this Concord. Founding delegates rarely build in that kind of contingency, without already carrying some private fear. They have not yet found the words to share with their new partners. A species that joined a galactic government hoping for the best, Serel said slowly, while quietly preparing from the very first architectural blueprint for the worst. That does sound, Vashi said, rather characteristic of the historical record's description of them. A door only they could open, he continued after a moment, hidden inside the very walls of the government they helped build. That is either the single most paranoid piece of architectural planning I have ever encountered, or the wisest. Maybe it's both, Serel said. It was Prayat Ashkavi, in fact, who found the next thread worth pulling, and he found it in a place none of them had thought to look. Buried deep in the Concord's decommissioned personnel archive, in a record set that had not been accessed in over 60 years, he located the retirement file of old Ren Pell, the archivist Vashi had mentioned only in passing, the one who had supposedly noticed the same anomaly during the Threndel plague crisis a lifetime earlier and been told, in no uncertain terms, to let it go. He kept a private journal, Prayat said, spreading the recovered files across the reading room table with the particular energy of a soldier who had finally found a target worth pursuing. Unofficial, off-the-record system entirely, the kind of thing personnel aren't technically supposed to keep at all, but nobody enforces that rule for retirees anymore. Most of it's mundane. Complaints about chamber acoustics, notes on his own retirement garden. But there's an entry, dated the week after the Threndel session, where he describes being called into his supervisor's office and told, and I'm reading this directly, that certain findings, quote, serve no one's interest and will not be entertained further, end quote. He doesn't name who gave the order, but he does something curious right after. He starts encrypting every subsequent journal entry, for the rest of his career, in a personal cipher nobody bothered to break until I ran it through decryption routines this afternoon. What was he protecting, Serel asked, if he'd already been ordered to drop it? Himself, I think, Prayat said quietly. There's a later entry, years afterward, where he writes that he suspects the order didn't come from any single counselor with something to hide, but from an old, unspoken understanding across several senior administrations, going back generations, that the cradle collapse story was simpler, tidier, and more useful to galactic stability than the truth might turn out to be. A tragedy the Concord could mourn safely was easier to govern around than a mystery it couldn't explain. He never accuses anyone directly. I think he genuinely believed, by the end of his life, that the suppression wasn't a conspiracy at all, just an old fear quietly agreeing with itself, generation after generation, until nobody even remembered it was a choice rather than a fact. Vashi absorbed this in the particular stillness that, among the eldest Overai, signaled deep and uncomfortable reflection. That is a harder thing to fight than a villain, Serel, he said finally. A villain can be confronted. An old, comfortable fear that an entire institution has quietly agreed not to examine simply reasserts itself, generation after generation, unless someone is stubborn enough to keep asking the question anyway. Then I suppose we'll have to be stubborn, Serel said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. The investigation nearly ended there regardless, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quieter, more effective mechanism of simple bureaucratic attrition. 3 separate department heads, over the following fortnight, raised concerns about resource allocation, about the appropriateness of an archival team pursuing what one memo dryly termed a 900-year-old sensor anomaly of uncertain relevance. And Serel found herself, more than once, summoned to meetings where the underlying message, however politely phrased, was clear. Some questions are permitted to remain interesting only for as long as they remain safely unanswered. It was Counselor Ilarion, informed quietly by Vashi of the mounting institutional resistance, who finally intervened. using the particular authority of a delegate old enough to have outlasted 3 generations of the administrators now trying to smooth the matter over. "I have sat in this Concord long enough," she told the assembled department heads. In a closed session Serel was permitted to observe from the gallery, to recognize the specific sound an institution makes when it has decided, without ever formally deciding anything, that a comfortable story is worth more than an uncomfortable truth. "I have made that mistake myself, more than once, in a career considerably longer than any of yours. I do not intend to make it again over something this important." The investigation continues, fully resourced, until it reaches an actual conclusion, not merely a convenient stopping point. Whatever the source of the old, unspoken hesitation Ren Pell had once described, it did not survive Ilarian's intervention, and the investigation, freed at last from the quiet friction of institutional comfort, moved forward in earnest. The breakthrough that finally gave them something more than architecture came nearly 2 months into the investigation, when Serel, working from an old hunch about the nature of the resonance keying described in the founding specification, requested access to the Concord's full historical sensor logs from the 12th anomalous window, the earliest of the 11 recorded incidents, dating back to a session convened during the Second Karsu War. Buried in sensor data nobody had thought worth reviewing in centuries, half-corrupted and requiring days of painstaking reconstruction work from the Concord's technical archive staff, she found a single, fragmentary energy signature that had registered for less than 4 seconds before vanishing entirely. A signature that matched nothing in any current Concord database, but that bore a structural resemblance, once properly modeled. To propulsion emissions, humanity's original delegation ships had used 9 centuries earlier, evolved, refined, and radically more efficient, but unmistakably descended from the same underlying technology. "They didn't die," Pryatt said, staring at the reconstructed data with an expression that had shifted, somewhere over the preceding weeks, from professional suspicion into something closer to reluctant, dawning awe. "Whatever happened after the cradle collapsed, they didn't die. They kept building. They kept advancing. And somehow they've been slipping in and out of the most secure room in Concord space for 900 years using technology that's still, apparently, ahead of anything we've developed since." He set the data slate down carefully, as though it had grown heavier in his hands over the course of the conversation, and rubbed a hand across his face in the particular gesture of someone recalibrating an entire framework of professional certainty all at once. "I came onto this investigation certain I would be the one to explain it away," he admitted. "I have spent my whole career trained to assume the worst about unaccounted variables, because that assumption has kept people alive more often than it has embarrassed me. I do not know what to do with a variable that keeps turning out to be a quiet, patient kindness instead." "Maybe you don't have to do anything with it yet," Serel said. "Maybe we just keep following the record the way we agreed and let the conclusion be whatever it actually turns out to be, rather than whatever either of us walked in expecting." Pryatt nodded slowly, and something in his posture over the following weeks settled into a steadier, more open kind of attention, the wariness of a soldier gradually giving way to the patience of someone genuinely willing to be surprised. "Which raises the only question that actually matters now," Vashi said quietly. "Not whether they survived, whether they intend to keep hiding, or whether 900 years of quiet, unacknowledged help was always meant to end with someone finally noticing enough to ask them to stop. The answer to that question arrived in the end, not through further investigation, but through crisis. In the particular way the galaxy's most consequential truths always seemed to reveal themselves when the stakes had grown too large for secrecy to survive them. It began with a signal, detected simultaneously by 4 separate deep space observation arrays along the Concord's outer frontier. A gravitational and electromagnetic disturbance, unlike anything in the Concord's 900-year catalog of known phenomena, emerging from a region of unclaimed space just beyond the border of Karsu territory. Within days, the disturbance resolved into something far more alarming than an unusual astronomical event. An object, vast beyond any scale the Concord shipbuilders had ever attempted, moving under clear and deliberate propulsion, on a trajectory that would bring it, within 11 months, directly through the heart of the Concord's most densely populated systems. Concord xenoarchaeologists, working around the clock as panic rippled outward through every Allied system, eventually matched the object's structural signatures to a category of ancient, pre-Concord artifact that had only ever been found before in fragments. A Warden-class construct, built by a civilization so far predating any of the 5 founding species that its makers were known to current scholarship only through the scattered ruins they had left behind across a dozen systems. Ruins that every prior study had assumed were the remnants of some ancient conflict long since concluded. This one, unlike every fragment found before it, was still fully intact, and it was unmistakably awake. The Concord's military strategists modeled every response they could construct within the narrowing window of time, and every model returned the same grim conclusion. Nothing in the Concord's current arsenal, not even the combined defense fleets of all 5 founding species acting in perfect, unprecedented coordination, could guarantee stopping an object of that scale and unknown purpose before it reached inhabited space. The best available strategy, presented to the full council in a session so tense that even Serel, watching from the archivist's gallery, found her bioluminescent patterns flickering with an anxiety she had never before experienced in her sheltered career, was evacuation on a scale the Concord had never attempted, buying time and hoping, without any real confidence, that the construct's purpose might prove less catastrophic than its scale suggested. The 11 months of the construct's approach compressed, in practice, into a far narrower window of genuine preparation time, as the first 3 months were consumed almost entirely by the logistics of simply agreeing which systems would be evacuated first, in what order, and under whose authority, a debate that Serel watched unfold with a growing, helpless frustration at how much of the Concord's remaining time was being spent negotiating procedure rather than saving lives. Delegate Muriel's own homeworld, still within the construct's projected corridor of approach according to the earliest trajectory models, became a particular flashpoint, her people demanding priority evacuation resources on the grounds of proximity, while 3 other member systems argued, not unreasonably, that their own populations were larger and therefore more urgent to relocate first. It was during those tense, grinding months of preparation that Serel found herself working double duty, splitting her hours between the ongoing human delegation investigation and an emergency reassignment to the Concord's crisis archive, cataloging evacuation logistics in real time so that future historians, if there were any future historians left to write the account, would have an accurate record of how the galaxy had chosen to spend its final months of ignorance. She slept poorly during that stretch, when she slept at all, and found herself returning, again and again, to the fragmentary 4th-century energy signature Pryatt had reconstructed, wondering whether whatever ghost had once haunted humanity's abandoned seat was even aware of the catastrophe now bearing down on the systems it had spent 9 centuries quietly protecting. She got her answer 4 months before the construct's projected arrival, when Pryatt burst into the archive gallery. Uncharacteristically breathless, clutching a data slate with a fresh sensor log from the Outer Frontier Observation Array. "It's not just approaching," he said. "It changed course 2 days ago, subtly, almost undetectably on a heading that puts it on a much faster intercept trajectory with unclaimed space near the Karsu border rather than continuing straight toward inhabited systems. Something met it out there. Something small, fast, and completely unregistered in any Concord tracking database." It was during that session, in the final minutes before the vote on evacuation protocols was to be called, that the biometric registry lit up once more, glowing its familiar impossible green across seat 7, and this time, For the first time in 911 years, someone actually appeared. He did not arrive through any door the chamber's security teams could later identify, and the review of every sensor in the building afterward would show only the same fragmentary, gone-in-an-instant energy signature the Concord had already learned to associate with humanity's ghost. One moment Seat 7 stood empty, as it had for 9 centuries. The next, a man was simply sitting in it, dressed in a plain, dark uniform bearing no insignia the Concord's archives could immediately place, his posture calm in a way that felt, to every delegate in that stunned chamber, both deeply reassuring and profoundly unsettling in equal measure. "My apologies for the delay," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics without any visible amplification device, in the same plain, direct cadence that centuries-old diplomatic records described as characteristic of his species' original delegates. "We were confirming the construct's intent before committing to a response. I understand that must have felt like an eternity, given your timeline. I promise you it was not wasted." Counselor Asim was on his feet before anyone else could speak, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm too fast for calm. "Identify yourself. Explain your presence in this chamber, your species' technology, and your intentions immediately, or I will move for this council to treat your arrival as a hostile incursion." "My name is Ambassador Corin Vale," the man said, unhurried, meeting the counselor's agitation with a stillness that seemed to diffuse rather than provoke it. "I hold, as far as I am aware, the oldest continuously active diplomatic commission in Concord history, though I will readily admit that commission has been exercised somewhat unconventionally these past 9 centuries. My intentions, tonight and every night before it, have been exactly what they appear to be. I am here because my government made a promise a very long time ago, and we have never stopped keeping it, even after the Concord stopped expecting us to." "Your government," Neith Ilarion said slowly, rising from her own seat with an expression Serel could not fully read, "was declared extinct 911 years ago." "Declared," Vale said, with the faintest trace of something that might, in a species less controlled, have been rueful humor, "is doing quite a lot of work in that sentence, Counselor. We are very much not extinct. We made a choice, a long time ago, that I understand now. Looking back with the benefit of 9 centuries of hindsight, we explained badly and far too late to prevent the consequences that followed. I am hopeful there will be time tonight to correct that. But I would respectfully suggest that the construct currently on approach toward your inhabited systems represents a more immediate priority than my species' apparently exaggerated obituary." Delegate Muriel, seated near the front of the chamber, rose slowly to her feet, her voice unsteady in a way that carried through the stunned silence with unusual force. "You were there," she said. "The Threndel Plague, my grandmother's generation. The vote that came through in the final minutes when every projection said we had already run out of time. That was you, or your people, someone from your delegation." "It was," Vale said, and something in his composed bearing softened as he turned toward her, "though I confess it was not I personally who sat in that session. I was not yet born when it occurred. But yes, delegate, that was us." Muriel sat back down slowly, one hand pressed briefly to her chest, and said nothing further, though the look she gave Vale carried more weight than any formal statement the session record would later capture. Counselor Asim, still standing, was not so easily moved. "Convenient timing for a reappearance," he said. "You return to us in the very session where we are debating how to respond to your presence, on the eve of the greatest external threat this Concord has faced in a generation. Forgive me if I find the coincidence difficult to accept at face value." "It is not a coincidence, Counselor," Vale said. "It is the reason I am here at all. We have watched this construct's approach for some months now, from considerably further out than your own observation arrays are currently capable of reaching. I did not come tonight to settle old history. I came because your evacuation vote was about to commit hundreds of millions of people to an upheaval that may not, in the end, prove necessary. And I judged that the risk of finally revealing ourselves was smaller than the risk of watching you make that decision without every piece of relevant information in front of you. The revelation that followed, delivered by Vale with the same unhurried, methodical clarity that historical records suggested, had once made humanity's original delegation so effective in crisis negotiations, reframed everything the Concord believed about the cradle collapse. Humanity had not turned inward out of secrecy for its own sake, Vale explained, but because that same routine survey mission, the historical record vaguely referenced, had discovered something that early human scientists believed, at the time, posed an existential risk not just to Earth, but to every inhabited system in the region. Evidence that the ancient, warden-building civilization whose ruins scattered the galaxy had not, in fact, gone extinct through internal conflict as prevailing Concord scholarship assumed, but had instead entered a form of dormancy after encountering something even they could not defeat, leaving behind automated systems, like the very construct now approaching, still faithfully executing orders whose original purpose no living species fully understood. We believed, at the time, that disclosing what we had found would trigger exactly the kind of panicked, uncoordinated response that could provoke whatever remained of that ancient system into premature action, Vale said. We were young, as a species in this Concord, and we did not yet trust that our founding partners would respond to that knowledge with patience rather than fear. That misjudgment, more than any single decision the Concord made in response, is the true origin of the silence that followed. We withdrew not because we had died, but because we believed, wrongly and at great cost, that withdrawing quietly was safer for everyone than staying and risking a mistake we could not undo. And the 11 crises since, Serel said, her voice barely audible in the vast chamber, surprising herself as much as anyone by speaking at all. The plague, the wars, the terraforming failure, all of it was your government quietly intervening the entire time. Vale turned toward the archivist's gallery, and for a moment his composed expression softened into something that looked, disarmingly, almost apologetic. We could not undo our original mistake by revealing ourselves and asking the Concord to simply trust us again, not after 9 centuries of silence we ourselves had chosen. So we did what we could without asking for that trust. We watched. We intervened where intervention could prevent irreversible loss, quietly enough that no single act would force the question of our survival before we were prepared to answer it honestly. I understand now, hearing it said aloud in this chamber, exactly how that must look. I am not certain it was the right choice. I am certain it was the only one we could live with. The construct reached the outer edge of Concord space 11 days later, and it was Vale in the end, standing not in the concordance chamber, but aboard a small, unremarkable human vessel that placed itself directly in the construct's path, who resolved a confrontation that no combined Concord fleet could have survived. The full details of that exchange, transmitted back to the Concord in fragments over the following weeks, described not a battle but a conversation, conducted in a language humanity's own long-isolated researchers had spent decades quietly reconstructing from Warden-era ruins scattered across a dozen systems. The same patient, unglamorous archival work that Concord scholars had dismissed for centuries as an eccentric, low-priority academic footnote. Serel would later read the recovered transcript of that exchange so many times she could recite portions of it from memory, and she found herself, each time, most struck not by the technical negotiation itself, but by the almost gentle patience Vale had shown throughout, addressing an ancient, half-awake machine the size of a small moon with the same unhurried calm he had shown the council on the night of his return. The construct, according to the transcript, had introduced itself not with a name but with a designation and a purpose, a caretaker unit assigned to investigate any stellar anomaly within its patrol radius exceeding a threshold its long-vanished builders had set 900 millennia earlier, and to apply corrective measures if the anomaly indicated the resurgence of a threat its makers had once fought and never fully extinguished. The stellar event that woke you, Vale told it AC. According to the recovered log, was not the threat your makers feared. It was an unrelated collapse, natural in origin, that happened to fall within the boundary conditions of your patrol threshold. I understand that distinguishing between those two possibilities was likely difficult from your position, given how long you have slept and how much has changed in the systems around you since your last active cycle. I am not asking you to abandon your purpose. I am telling you, as clearly as I am able, that the purpose does not require action here. The construct, according to the transcript, took nearly 6 hours to respond, a silence that must have felt, to the small crew aboard Vale's vessel, considerably longer than any 6 hours either species had previously endured. When it finally answered, it did so not with argument but with a request for verification, a slow, methodical cross-referencing of Vale's claims against fragments of its own ancient sensor logs, the ponderous deliberation of a mind built to be thorough rather than fast. Only once that verification concluded, satisfied, did it alter its course, drifting quietly back toward the edge of known space, and returned, as far as any subsequent observation could determine, to its long and patient sleep. It was during the Concord's celebration session that followed, a gathering unlike any the chamber had hosted in living memory, that Ambassador Vale made the request that would define the next chapter of Concord history far more than the crisis itself ever had. "I'm not here to ask forgiveness for 900 years of silence," he said, standing this time rather than seated, addressing a chamber packed with delegates who, only weeks earlier, had been debating whether to treat his presence as an act of war. That would be a request made on behalf of people who are, by now, many generations removed from the ones who made the original mistake, and I do not think it is mine to make for them. What I am here to ask is simpler. My government would like, after 911 years, to formally resume its seat in this chamber, not as a ghost slipping quietly through gaps in your security systems, but as a member present in the room, accountable to the same scrutiny, the same debate, the same disagreements, as every other founding species represented here. We have spent 9 centuries proving, in the only way we believed was available to us, that we could still be trusted with a voice in this government. I would like the chance now to prove it the honest way instead. The vote to formally reinstate humanity's founding membership passed that same session, with a margin so overwhelming that even Counselor Awesome, still visibly wary but no longer hostile, cast his vote in favor, muttering afterward to a colleague that he would rather have an occasionally exasperating ally who had proven, across 9 centuries, to always show up when it mattered, than continue pretending that seat was ever truly empty in the first place. Serel Cadran, whose careful, ordinary act of routine record-keeping had unraveled 900 years of quiet mystery, was invited, in the weeks that followed, to serve as the Concord's newly appointed liaison archivist to the restored human delegation, a position created specifically because, as Vashi dryly noted in his recommendation, no one else in the Concord had earned the role quite so thoroughly by simply refusing to stop asking an inconvenient question. She accepted, and spent the following years working alongside Ambassador Vale and the growing human delegation that followed him back into open Concord life, listening to stories, slowly and patiently shared, about the 9 centuries humanity had spent rebuilding itself in careful, deliberate isolation, wary of repeating the same fear-driven mistake that had cost them their place in galactic society the first time. Prayat Ashkavi, whose reconstruction of the old 4th century sensor signature had cracked the investigation open when nothing else could, found himself reassigned, at his own request, to a newly formed liaison security unit tasked with coordinating between Concord Defense Forces and the human delegation's own considerably more advanced protocols, a posting he described to Serel, some months later, as the strangest and most satisfying assignment of his career. I spent my whole life training to identify threats before they materialize, he told her, over a quiet meal in the archive gallery they had once shared during the long, uncertain months of investigation. I never expected the biggest threat I ever chased down would turn out to be an ally who'd been quietly saving us the entire time. It's an odd thing, retraining your instincts around that. I think it's a good kind of odd, though. I think I needed it. Counselor Asim, true to the particular integrity that had made him such a stubborn obstacle throughout the investigation, was among the first delegates to formally request a private meeting with Ambassador Vale once the Chamber's business allowed for it. And though neither man ever fully described the contents of that conversation to anyone outside it, Asim's public posture toward the human delegation shifted, in the months that followed, from wary suspicion into something that looked, to those who knew him well, remarkably like respect hard-won through honest disagreement rather than easy sentiment. I still believe caution matters, he told Serel once, in the dry, clipped tone she had come to recognize as his version of warmth. I simply no longer believe this particular caution was warranted. There is a difference, and I am glad for once to have been wrong about which side of it we were standing on. On the anniversary of the reinstatement vote, exactly 1 year later, Serel found herself once more in the concordance chamber, this time not auditing an empty registry but watching seat 7 filled, openly and without any need for hidden resonance keys or fragmentary energy signatures, by a human delegate attending a perfectly ordinary session on trade regulation, the kind of unremarkable governance business that, 9 centuries earlier, humanity's original delegates had also once quietly, stubbornly excelled at. "Do you ever think about how close it came to staying buried?" she asked Vale afterward, in the quiet chamber gallery where she had first found the anomaly that changed everything. If I hadn't pulled that particular audit, if Vashi hadn't remembered Ren Pell's old story, if the council had voted differently that first day. I think about it constantly, Vale admitted, and for once the careful diplomatic composure slipped enough to let something more tired, more human, show through. We built a door only we could open, 900 years ago, because we were afraid of a galaxy that might not forgive us, and afraid, too, of losing the chance to help it if we ever needed to. What we never quite planned for was what would happen if nobody on your side ever thought to knock. I am glad, more than I can easily say, that someone finally did. You could have knocked yourselves, Serel said. Any one of those 11 sessions. You could have simply announced yourselves instead of vanishing again each time the crisis passed. Vale was quiet for a moment, watching the ordinary, unremarkable trade session continue below them, delegates arguing gently over tariff schedules in a chamber that had, within the span of one improbable year, become something neither species had quite dared to hope for again. I think, somewhere in all that watching, he said finally, we were waiting to be asked back, rather than simply inviting ourselves. It felt, after everything, like the kind of return that needed an invitation to actually mean something. I am glad it finally came. I am glad, even more, that it came because someone cared enough about an old, empty seat to wonder why it had never quite felt entirely empty at all. He looked down at the pale wooden chair below, its silver grain catching the chamber's soft light, and something in his expression, for just a moment, resembled the weary, grateful relief of someone finally permitted to set down a burden they had carried alone for far longer than anyone should reasonably have to. My predecessors sat in that chair 900 years ago and believed in the end that leaving quietly was an act of protection, he said. I have spent a good portion of my life since wondering whether they were right to believe that, or whether it was simply the fear talking, dressed up as wisdom. I do not think I will ever fully resolve that question, but I find I no longer need to resolve it alone, and that, more than anything else this past year has given us, feels like the actual homecoming. Below them, the session continued, ordinary and unremarkable, and, for the first time in 911 years, entirely, openly whole.